They say no good deed goes unpunished, but I never thought saving a man's life would land me in court fighting for my freedom. My name's Marcus Walker, and this whole mess started on a rainy Tuesday evening. I was driving down Route 72, the rain pounding on my windshield like it had a personal grudge against me. The wipers were working overtime just to keep the road visible. That's when I saw it, a black sedan, twisted like a soda can, flipped on its side in the ditch. Smoke curled up from the engine, and the driver's side door was crunched into a mangled mess of metal. I slammed on the brakes, my heart racing, and pulled over onto the shoulder. Instinct took over. I didn't think about danger or consequences, I just ran toward the wreckage. The acrid smell of burning rubber filled the air as I climbed over the wet grass, mud clinging to my sneakers. I could hear groaning from inside the car. "Hey," I shouted, cupping my hands around my mouth. "Can you hear me?" "Help," came a weak voice. I yanked on the passenger door, but it wouldn't budge. My fingers slipped against the slick metal. I circled around to the back and shattered the window with my elbow, ignoring the sting as shards nicked my skin. Reaching in, I grabbed the guy under his arms and pulled with everything I had. He wasn't a small man, maybe late 40s, thick around the middle. His head lolled against his chest, blood trickling from a gash on his temple. His right leg looked twisted at an angle legs aren't supposed to bend. "Hang on, man," I grunted. "I got you." The heat from the engine was getting worse, and flames were licking up the side of the car. My lungs burned from the smoke, but I didn't let go. I dragged him free and collapsed onto the wet ground, gasping for air. Then I noticed it, my left hand. Blood was gushing from where 3 of my fingers had been. Gone. I didn't even remember how it happened. "Jesus," I muttered, my voice shaking. My vision blurred, but I kept my grip on the guy. Sirens wailed in the distance, and relief washed over me. The paramedics arrived in a flurry of flashing lights and frantic voices. One of them knelt beside me. "We'll take it from here," she said, gently prying the injured man from my grip. I sat there in shock, cradling my mutilated hand, rain mixing with blood on my skin. I'd saved his life, that much I knew. But I had no idea my nightmare was just beginning. The hospital wasn't exactly where I'd planned to spend the night, but there I was, lying on a stiff bed, my hand bandaged and throbbing with pain. The nurse had pumped me full of painkillers, but they barely dulled the ache. I stared at the ceiling tiles, replaying the accident in my head. The guy I pulled out of that car, the doctors said he was going to make it. His name was Todd Henderson, some kind of financial advisor or something. Middle-aged, married with 2 kids, from what the cop told me when he took my statement. "You're lucky to be alive," the officer had said, jotting notes on a little pad. "Hell of a thing you did out there, pulling him out like that." Lucky wasn't exactly how I felt, but I nodded anyway. Just did what anybody would have done. "You lost some fingers, though. That's rough, man." He looked down at my bandaged hand with a sympathetic grimace. "But hey, you saved a life. That's what counts." I figured that was the end of it. A tragic accident, a heroic save, case closed. But 2 days later, I found out just how wrong I was. It started with a knock on my apartment door. I was sitting on the couch, trying to figure out how I was supposed to tie my shoes with only 7 fingers, when the pounding made me jump. "Marcus Walker." I opened the door to find 2 cops standing there, stone-faced. One was a stocky guy with a thick mustache, and the other was a woman with sharp eyes that didn't miss a thing. "Yeah?" I said cautiously. "You're under arrest," Mustache said, pulling out a pair of cuffs. "What?" My voice came out in a shaky laugh. "For what?" "Assault and battery, plus reckless endangerment," Sharp Eyes added, her tone flat as a pancake. I blinked, trying to process what she'd just said. "You've got to be kidding me. I saved that guy's life." "That's not what he's saying," Mustache grunted. Before I could argue, they had me spun around, wrists clamped in cold steel. My heart was racing, disbelief flooding through me. Wait, this is a mistake. I didn't hurt anyone." "Tell it to the judge," Mustache said, as they marched me out of my own apartment. Neighbors peeked through cracked doors, their curious eyes following me down the hall. My face burned with humiliation. This couldn't be happening. But it was. And as they shoved me into the back of the squad car, I knew one thing for sure. Somebody was out to bury me. The ride to the station was surreal. My mind raced, trying to make sense of how I'd gone from hero to criminal in a matter of days. The rain drummed against the roof of the cruiser, matching the pounding in my chest. What the hell was Todd Henderson telling them? That I attacked him? The guy had been unconscious when I dragged him out of the car. And reckless endangerment, I pulled him from a burning wreck. The accusations made no sense, but neither did being handcuffed in the back seat. At the station, they booked me like I was some kind of career criminal. Fingerprints, mugshots, the whole humiliating process. My hand throbbed as I pressed it against the scanner, the bandages stained with fresh blood. "You're a real hero, huh?" the officer sneered as he snapped my picture. "Bet your mama's proud." I clenched my jaw, biting back a retort. They threw me in a holding cell with a couple of guys who looked like they belonged there. One had tattoos crawling up his neck, and the other was slumped on the bench, muttering to himself. "First time?" Tattoo Neck asked, sizing me up. "Yeah," I muttered, sitting as far from him as possible. "Better get used to it, hero," he said with a smirk. I didn't respond. My thoughts were stuck on Todd Henderson and the cops' accusations. What kind of man lies about the person who saved his life? After what felt like hours, a guard unlocked the cell and called my name. "Walker, you're up." They led me into an interrogation room where a detective with graying hair and a permanent scowl was waiting. He introduced himself as Detective Lewis and gestured for me to sit. "You know why you're here, right?" he asked, flipping open a file. "No," I said firmly. "I saved that man's life." Lewis leaned back, folding his arms across his chest. "Todd Henderson tells a different story. Says you pulled him from the car, sure, but not before roughing him up and threatening to leave him there unless he paid you." I stared at him, stunned. "That's a damn lie." He shrugged like he didn't care one way or the other. "He's got a busted leg, broken ribs, and says you're the reason for half of it." "That car was on fire," I snapped. "I pulled him out before it exploded." Lewis sighed, like he'd heard every excuse in the book. "Funny thing is, Henderson's got connections, big ones, and people listen to guys like him." He tapped the file, "especially when they're talking about guys like you." The implication hung heavy in the air. I didn't need him to spell it out. I was a black man in the wrong place at the wrong time, and Todd Henderson was a white man with money and influence. "You gonna charge me or what?" I asked, my voice hard. "Oh, you're getting charged," Lewis said, standing up. "Assault, extortion, and reckless endangerment. Hope you got a good lawyer, Walker. You're gonna need one." My stomach churned as they hauled me back to the cell. The truth didn't matter here, only the story Todd Henderson was spinning. And I had a sinking feeling it was going to stick. The courtroom was cold, both in temperature and in atmosphere. Pale wood benches stretched across the room, packed with spectators whispering behind cupped hands. At the front, Judge Robert Whitaker sat on his high bench, gavel within reach like a weapon waiting to strike. He was an older man with thinning white hair and an expression as sour as spoiled milk. From the moment he walked in, I could feel the weight of his disdain pressing down on me. His eyes flicked my way with barely concealed contempt before settling on the prosecutor with something closer to approval. Yeah, I knew exactly what kind of man he was. My lawyer, Steve Daniels, leaned toward me. He was a decent guy, overworked and underpaid, but sharp when it counted. "Just keep your cool, Marcus," he whispered. "We've got a solid case." I nodded, though my gut told me otherwise. The prosecutor, a slick-looking man named Brent Foster, strutted to the jury like he owned the place. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice dripping with theatrics, "this case isn't about heroism. It's about violence, greed, and a man who took advantage of a vulnerable victim." I bit my tongue so hard I tasted blood. Greed? Violence? I lost 3 damn fingers saving that man's life. Foster painted a picture of me as some kind of thug who saw a wealthy man in distress and decided to cash in. He claimed I threatened Henderson, demanded money, and used excessive force to pull him from the wreckage. Henderson's injuries, according to Foster, were as much my doing as the car crash. When it was Daniel's turn, he stood tall, his voice steady. "What you're hearing is a twisted narrative crafted to ruin an innocent man's life. Marcus Walker didn't ask for money. He didn't assault anyone. He risked his own life and paid a heavy price to save Todd Henderson. He held up photos of my mangled hand, the bandages still fresh. The jury flinched at the sight. Our evidence will show the truth, Daniels promised. The evidence was strong: photos of the burning car, eyewitness testimony from the paramedics who saw me bleeding on the ground beside Henderson. But truth doesn't always win in court. Henderson took the stand, his leg in a brace and his arm in a sling. He looked every bit the injured victim. His voice quivered as he described the accident, painting himself as a helpless man at the mercy of a stranger. He said he wouldn't help me unless I promised to pay him, Henderson claimed, his eyes wide with practiced sincerity. When I hesitated, he grabbed me rough, like I was some animal. It was a master class in deceit. The jury hung on his every word, nodding sympathetically. When Daniels cross-examined him, he pressed hard. "Mr. Henderson, are you aware that Marcus Walker lost 3 fingers while saving your life?" Henderson's expression tightened. "I can't speak to that. I was barely conscious." "And yet you remember him demanding money?" Daniels shot back. "I remember enough," Henderson said coldly. I clenched my fists under the table, my heart pounding. The lies were piling up, and the judge was eating them up with that thin-lipped smirk of his. By the end of the day, I knew we were in deep trouble. The system wasn't built for guys like me. And this courtroom? It was a stage where Todd Henderson played the victim while I was cast as the villain. The day of the verdict came faster than I was ready for. The courtroom was packed again, the air heavy with anticipation. Reporters lined the back wall, cameras slung around their necks, waiting to capture whatever drama unfolded. My stomach twisted into knots, but I kept my face blank. Steve Daniels sat beside me, his jaw clenched so tight I thought he might crack a tooth. "Whatever happens, we'll appeal," he muttered under his breath. "This isn't over." I nodded, though my hope had been bleeding out since the trial started. Whitaker's bias had been obvious, from the way he shot down Daniels' objections to how he practically beamed at Foster like they shared drinks at the same country club. Judge Whitaker entered the room, his black robe swishing around him as he took his seat. The jury filed in, their faces unreadable. My heart thudded in my chest like a drumbeat of doom. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Whitaker asked, his voice cool and authoritative. A middle-aged woman with kind eyes stood up, holding a folded piece of paper. "We have, Your Honor." "Please read the verdict." She unfolded the paper, her hands trembling slightly. "On the charge of assault and battery, we find the defendant, Marcus Walker, guilty." A collective gasp rippled through the room. My breath caught in my throat, the word echoing in my ears. The woman continued, her voice faltering. "On the charge of reckless endangerment, guilty." My chest tightened, anger and disbelief warring inside me. I saved that man's life. I lost parts of myself doing it. And now I was being punished for it. Judge Whitaker nodded with a smug satisfaction that made me want to scream. "Thank you, jury, for your service." He turned to me, his expression colder than the steel of the handcuffs waiting for me. "Marcus Walker, you have been found guilty by a jury of your peers." Peers? I wanted to laugh. There hadn't been a single black face on that jury. "Sentencing will be held tomorrow," Whitaker said, his voice sharp. "Court adjourned." He banged his gavel with finality. The room erupted into whispers and murmurs. Daniels grabbed my arm as I stood, my legs shaky. "This isn't over," he said firmly. "We'll fight this." But I barely heard him. My eyes locked onto Todd Henderson, standing near the exit, leaning on a cane. He didn't look injured enough to justify the lies he told. His gaze met mine, and for a split second I saw something in his eyes. Guilt, maybe? Or just satisfaction at having won. The bailiff cuffed my wrists, and I felt the cold metal bite into my skin. They led me out of the courtroom, past the reporters shouting questions I didn't bother answering. As the heavy door closed behind me, the truth settled over me like a weight I'd carry forever. The system had never been about justice for people like me. But they hadn't broken me yet. And deep down, I knew one thing. If they thought I was just going to roll over and accept this, they didn't know Marcus Walker. Not by a long shot. The prison van rattled along the cracked highway, the metal cage around us vibrating with each bump in the road. The other prisoners sat with their heads bowed, eyes vacant, each lost in his own grim thoughts. I leaned against the grated window, watching fields blur into patches of nothingness. My arm throbbed with a dull, relentless ache, a bitter souvenir from that night on Highway 72, the night I saved a man's life and lost pieces of my own. Steve Daniels had promised we'd fight the verdict, file appeals, do everything by the book. But I knew how the book was written, and it wasn't in my favor. I was a black man with the word guilty stamped across my life, while Todd Henderson's lies carried the weight of gospel truth. But I wasn't ready to call it quits. Prison wasn't going to be my end. The entire time I spent behind those concrete walls, one question gnawed at me like a stray dog on a bone. What am I missing? I thought about that night over and over. The rain, the twisted metal, the flames. I saw Henderson's bleeding face, felt my own mangled hand slick with blood. The facts didn't add up, but nobody cared. Time passed in that slow, grinding way prison has. I was starting to resign myself to the waiting, to the heavy passage of days when a guard called my name. "Walker, interrogation room, move it." My pulse quickened. This wasn't routine. The room was stark, lit by flickering fluorescent lights. Behind the metal table sat a woman I'd never seen before. She was young, sharp-eyed, and her presence cut through the room like a blade. Her tailored suit stood out like a bright flag in this grim place. "Marcus Walker?" she asked, standing and extending her hand. "Yeah." I took it cautiously. "Sheila Grant," she said with a confident nod. "I'm a lawyer." I sank into the chair across from her. "What brings you here?" "Your case," she said, folding her hands on the table. "It's part of a pattern I've been investigating. High-profile cases where the outcomes were suspicious. And there's one common denominator, Judge Whittaker." I frowned. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying your conviction smells rotten, Marcus, and I think I know where to start digging." I leaned forward, intrigued despite myself. "Yeah? Where's that?" Her eyes gleamed with determination. Why wasn't there a dashcam found in a car as expensive as Todd Henderson's? A man with his money and status. Those cars don't roll off the lot without cameras these days. The question hit me like a jolt of electricity. I'd never thought about it, not once. But she was right. I narrowed my eyes. "You think someone hid it?" "I think someone made it disappear," she said firmly. "And if I find it, we're going to turn this whole thing upside down." For the first time in months, hope flickered in my chest, small but real. Sheila Grant wasn't just talking, she was ready for a fight. And so was I. And the day has come. The courtroom buzzed with quiet anticipation, every seat filled for the final day of my appeal. My new lawyer, Sheila Grant, had torn through Todd Henderson's lies like a surgeon wielding a scalpel. She was relentless, sharp as a blade, and determined to get justice, and she had the evidence to do it. It came down to one thing: a dashcam video. The footage had been buried deep, conveniently lost, by a towing company that hauled away Henderson's wrecked car. Sheila's investigator tracked it down, dusted off, and presented it in court. On the screen, the jury saw everything: my desperate struggle to pull Henderson from the wreckage, flames licking dangerously close. They saw my hand pinned by twisted metal and heard my shout of pain. But what sealed it was Henderson's voice, weak but unmistakable. "Help me. Please, I'll give you anything." Not only had I never demanded a dime, but Henderson had offered payment himself, delirious from shock. The dashcam didn't lie. The courtroom fell into stunned silence. Henderson paled, beads of sweat forming on his brow as whispers rippled through the gallery. Judge Whittaker's face, always smug and certain, now resembled a man who'd swallowed a lemon. Sheila drove the point home. "Ladies and gentlemen, this man lied under oath to ruin Marcus Walker's life. He perjured himself to save his reputation." The prosecutor squirmed, scrambling to contain the fallout, but it was too late. Within a week, Henderson was charged with perjury and obstruction of justice. His reputation crumbled, his financial firm imploded, and the same system that had tried to bury me now turned its teeth on him. As for me, the settlement came swiftly, a hefty payout that could never replace what I'd lost, but ensured I wouldn't have to worry about money again. The courtroom cheered when my conviction was overturned, though I barely heard it through the rush of relief. Outside the courthouse, Sheila clapped me on the back. "You did it, Marcus. It's over." I looked up at the sky, the weight of 2 years of injustice finally lifting. "Thanks, Sheila. For everything," she smiled. "Go live your life. You've earned it." That night, sitting on my apartment balcony with a beer in hand, I thought about Todd Henderson and all the pain his lies had caused. But I didn't regret pulling him out of that car. If I had to do it all over again, I wouldn't change a thing. Saving his life had been the right thing to do, and no amount of lies or betrayal could tarnish that. The world could be ugly and unfair, but at least I knew one thing. My conscience was clear. And that was worth more than any settlement. If this story resonated with you, share it with those who need to hear it. Let's start important conversations that will lead to change. Subscribe to our channel for more stories like this that challenge us, inspire us, and remind us of what we are capable of when we stand up for what is right. How about you?